This is Andre Damon with the World Socialist Web Site. Today we will be speaking with Jerry White, the editor of the World Socialist Web Site Autoworker Newsletter and a writer and editor on labor struggles for the WSWS. The World Socialist Web Site Autoworker Newsletter has played a leading role in mobilizing opposition to the Big Three and the UAW, who are seeking to impose further concessions onto workers in the current contract negotiations. The political exposures and perspective of the World Socialist Web Site have played a significant role in rallying opposition to the UAW Fiat Chrysler contract, which was voted down by workers earlier this month. Now, the WSWS is continuing its campaign to organize auto workers throughout the country and internationally in opposition to the demands of the auto bosses and their trade union allies. We will also speak to Eric London, a reporter for the World Socialist Web Site, who recently completed a reporting tour of the American Midwest, where he spoke to auto workers at plants in Tennessee, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, and other states. I'll just note here that we will be taking questions from our listeners. At the bottom of the page, you will see a link to send an email or leave a comment with your questions. Jerry, could you start by giving us a summary of the latest developments in the ongoing contract negotiations with the Big Three automakers?
Earlier this month, for the first time since 1982, auto workers in the United States rejected a contract, a national contract that was being promoted by the United Auto Workers Union. In a resounding vote by a margin of 2-1, they defeated the proposal that the UAW and Fiat Chrysler had sought to impose upon them. After the resounding defeat, the UAW sought to reconfigure a second sellout deal, which contains all of the strategic aims of the auto companies and of the UAW apparatus itself. And they're seeking to push through this contract on Tuesday and Wednesday of this week. Now, auto workers have suffered more than a decade of a wage freeze. And in 2007, the UAW agreed to establish the two-tier wage and benefit system, under which 40,000 workers hired after 2007 make little more than half of the wages of traditional workers, have inferior health care benefits, and have no pension. And workers were determined to get rid of the two-tier system, especially under conditions in which the auto companies are making record profits. CEOs like Sergio Marchionne of Fiat Chrysler made a $70 million bonus last year, and billions are going to corporate wealthy investors on Wall Street. But the new contract, just like the original, contains the same two-tier wage and benefit system, and far from the claims that the UAW and its New York City public relations firm Berlin Rosen have, that this is supposedly the richest contract ever negotiated, it will force second-tier workers to have to labor for 8 years before approaching the full wages of traditional workers. And the contract only runs for 4 years. So in the next contract, any such promises could be reneged upon. On top of that, workers are now finding out more and more details. The UAW has agreed to double the percentage of temporary workers who are hired in at $15.78 an hour. The contract contains the hated alternate work schedule, which forces workers to work 10-hour days with no overtime pay after 8 hours. And it continues the stagnation of wages of workers. It's an insulting 6% wage increase after, as I said, workers have suffered a decade of wage freezes. So there's tremendous opposition to the contract, to the second sellout deal. The union is doing everything it can to blackmail workers with threats of job losses, trying to offer higher signing bonuses. And the UAW is trying to brand any opposition to this sellout agreement as being members of the Right to Work Committee, the Republicans. And this, of course, is an outrageous slander. There's one To attack the UAW from the right, as the Republican Party does, is one thing. To attack it from the left, as the World Socialist Autoworker Newsletter, explaining that the UAW, far from defending the interests of the workers, is conspiring with the employers and the government against the workers, and therefore workers need new forms of organization to struggle.
Now, obviously, this contract proposal takes place against the background of decades of concessions, mass layoffs, wage and benefit cuts for auto workers. Could you speak a bit about the context of this current struggle?
Well, that's certainly the case. Since 1979, 1980, when the United Auto Workers was first brought onto the board of directors of Chrysler Corporation, the union abandoned any defense of the independent interests of workers. It colluded with the companies to shut down factories, to wipe out tens of thousands of jobs, to really transform auto workers, who were once the highest paid industrial workers in the world, into the ranks of the working poor. That process, as I said, began in 1979, 80. It was, of course, had long precedents before that. However, here they officially adopted the doctrine of labor management partnership, joining boards of directors, opposing any resistance of workers, and throughout the 80s and 90s, hundreds of thousands of workers lost their jobs. Now, by 2008, in the aftermath of the financial crisis, the worldwide crisis, the United Auto Workers joined with the Obama administration in expanding the two-tier wage system, in accepting the destruction of tens of thousands of jobs. And the union was paid as a reward with billions of dollars in corporate stocks to set up a retiree healthcare trust fund. So if you look at this as the immediate background, but if you just look, let's look at the last 6 weeks. First of all, a contract expiration was September the 14th. Workers were kept completely in the dark with the specious argument by the UAW that if they discussed what they were negotiating publicly, somehow this would tip off the companies, create rumors, when in fact the companies knew exactly what the UAW is up to. This was in no sense a negotiation between two antagonistic parties. It was a conspiracy of two business entities against the workers. And one of the sharpest expressions of that was when the UAW and Chrysler opened negotiations on July the 14th. The president of the UAW, Dennis Williams, announced in introducing his friend, Sergio Marchionne, the CEO of Fiat Chrysler, and he gave him a very warm embrace. And Marchionne responded by saying that far from there being adversarial conflict between the union and management, Marchionne said there was an alignment of interests, and that's really what's happened. It's a conspiracy of the union and management against workers.
So do you think that the UAW expected this contract to be voted down?
Well, the companies, the corporate-controlled media, the UAW, really thought that they could once again swindle workers, lie to workers, keep them in the dark, use the threat of layoffs and plant closings to force workers to accept another pro-company agreement. And they were caught completely off guard by a very powerful expression of opposition. Workers voted by 65% to defeat this contract. The UAW hoped that it could, quote, control the message by keeping a monopoly over information. But what workers did was they used Twitter, they used Facebook, they used other forms of social media to exchange information, including from the World Socialist Web Site Autoworker Newsletter, in order to expose what this contract was really about. And at one point this was referred to as a rebellion of young workers in particular.
Maybe you could just speak about that. What were workers most upset about in the contract proposal?
Well, again, the the issue of the two-tier system, first promoted in 2007, and I think it's very important to understand the Obama administration particularly insisted on the expansion of the two-tier system in 2009 during the bailout of the auto industry. There had originally been a 25% cap on the percentage of second-tier workers. And the Treasury Department said this would be removed in 2015. The UAW said it would be removed in 2015. And what actually happened was, far from reestablishing a limit on second-tier workers, it remains unlimited. And for a young worker who's working for half of the wages side by side with a worker making twice as much, for a young worker at Jefferson North Assembly Plant who is producing every minute a Jeep Cherokee that sells for $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 each, they're producing this, and yet they drive cars that are falling apart. They can't afford gas. In many cases, they're still living at home. There's no way that they can even meet their bills. And so there was enormous anger. And of course, this is not just auto workers. I mean, in the post-2008 period, the majority of jobs that have been created are part-time, casual, low-wage jobs. So this was really, as I said, a rebellion of the youngest workers determined not to live under conditions of poverty wages.
What about the question of this healthcare co-op that was proposed? Could you speak about that?
Well, sure. Just briefly, the auto companies and the UAW and the Obama administration have made it absolutely clear that they consider what auto workers won in the 1940s and 50s a cradle-to-grave healthcare system in which workers are guaranteed such benefits, that this was too costly. That and UAW officials themselves complained that the high cost of healthcare. Workers fought for those rights, and the Obama administration is using what they call the Cadillac tax to penalize supposedly too generous healthcare benefits, and the UAW is completely colluding with the company to cut costs. And it proposed the setting up of a healthcare co-op in which the UAW would be in charge of the provision of healthcare and the rationing and cutting of healthcare, just as it has done to retirees in the union-controlled medical trust fund. So this is a major strategic aim, not only of the auto companies and the banks behind them, but all of the corporations in the U.S. and around the world. They would like to end employer-paid healthcare benefits, shorten the life expectancy of workers, and shift whatever costs there are onto the backs of workers.
So, Jerry, just before we go into some of the broader political issues, I just wanted to ask, so this obviously takes place in context of an international attack on auto workers, as we've written on in the World Socialist website. Auto workers in Germany, Australia, and other countries are really facing similar attacks on their jobs, wages, and benefits. Could you perhaps briefly speak about that?
Well, the auto companies are, of course, transnational corporations, and a CEO like Sergio Marchionne looks at his conflict with American workers as part of a conflict with workers across the globe, rather. And in every case, whether it was the crisis of 2008, the financial crisis was utilized to restructure the auto industry, to seek to establish a permanently lower wage for workers, a lower benchmark around the world. You have now at Volkswagen, the largest automaker in the world, the utilization of the scandal that emerged over the emissions controls to restructure that company. The jobs of workers in Germany, in Mexico, and around the world are threatened. The unions in IG Metall in Germany are colluding with the employers in this attack. And once again, workers are being held accountable for the, in fact, criminal decisions of corporate executives over which they have no control. And in the past several years, well, let me just make one other point. The former CEO, Martin Winterkorn, who was forced to resign while workers face the brunt of the impact of the scandal, he is going to resign with approximately a $67 million golden parachute, including a $32 million pension. So in every case, the crisis, the economic downturn in Latin America has produced attacks on workers in Brazil, attacks on workers in South Korea. And in the past number of years, there have been struggles of workers, Mexico, South Korea, Turkey, Canada, one country after another, resisting these attacks. And that underscores the necessity for workers to develop an international strategy to resist these attacks.
Now, what would you say is the international significance of the developments in the U.S. auto industry, the growing struggle and militancy of auto workers in the U.S.? Do you think that has international consequences?
Well, it certainly does. Just as the assault on auto workers in America has had global implications. Just parenthetically, Sergio Marchionne went back to the Italian Fiat workers earlier this year, and he insisted that if workers didn't accept American-style profit sharing, which tied wages to the profits of the corporations, that he would move production to the United States for cheaper labor. So the 2009 restructuring of the auto industry had a global impact, and the reemergence of opposition of the American working class, which has it has so long been suppressed by the trade unions, the United Auto Workers Union, the AFL-CIO. The reemergence of the working class will have global implications. There is a real parallel between the no vote of Chrysler workers in earlier this month by a 2-to-1 margin, and the expression of the Greek workers, who also voted by a 2-to-1 margin against the imposition of austerity. The auto workers' opposition is an expression of the opposition of broad sections of the working class. Since the 2008 crisis, 95% of the income gains have gone to the richest 1% of the population. The Obama administration has overseen a so-called economic recovery, which has been at the expense of the working class as corporate profits and stock markets hit record levels. Wages are at the lowest levels since, in percentage of the GDP, since the Second World War. Every section of workers, teachers, steel workers, telecom workers are facing the same struggles, but everywhere they're seeking to express their opposition, but it's coming into a direct collision with the unions, which function as the enforcers of austerity, of wage cutting, all over the world.
So I'm going to direct my next question to Eric London. What has been the role of the WSWS Autoworker Newsletter in mobilizing opposition to the contract?
Well, from the very beginning, there was a deep opposition amongst auto workers to the contract. As Jerry noted, it basically contained nothing that the workers had demanded. An alternative work schedule was maintained. The multi-tiered system was maintained. There was no reestablishment of a cost of living adjustment. The wage increases were paltry. Considering inflation, they would amount to basically nothing. And workers were justifiably furious that the UAW and the company would put forward such a concession contract, especially in the wake of, in 2007 and 2009 and 2011, the efforts by the union to work on behalf of the companies to force through concessions using the lie that it was justified to keep the companies afloat because of the recession. Well, now that lie has been made very clear, and the Autoworker Newsletter has from the beginning sought to give political expression to the opposition that exists among auto workers, and also to tell workers the truth. One of the challenges that auto workers have faced in the last several weeks is that they've got a lot of enemies. You know, they've got not just the UAW and the corporation, but also the corporate press, which has been working on behalf of the companies to spread a series of lies saying that workers are very well paid, that the wage increases are fantastic, that basically auto workers are selfish for demanding significant increases in wages. But this flies in the face of the reality that the vast majority of auto workers face. I in traveling through Indiana and Missouri and Kentucky, Tennessee, we come across workers who are homeless, who are living across the street from the plant because they can't afford to pay their rent because of the UAW and the company's decades and decades of concessions. We've come across large numbers of workers who are facing foreclosure, who have to make their car payments. As Jerry said, some workers whose cars are breaking down on the way to a plant where they're making a $50,000 vehicle. And it's in the face of these. So the corporate media assault on the auto workers has taken place in this context. And the Autoworker Newsletter has, on a daily basis, published an average of just under 2 articles. Since the contract began, I think we published 100 articles, news pieces, political analysis, programmatic statements, interviews with auto workers from the United States and around the world. And our program is to provide political advice to workers, to make it clear who our friends and who our enemies are, and to pave the way for the building of a mass movement of the working class on an international level whose purpose is to fight for social equality.
So this question is directed to both of you. What's been the response of workers to the WSWS's intervention?
Well, we've been getting responses from all over the country, and in fact all over the world, about the Autoworker Newsletter. If I could read just a couple of quotes, and these are not exceptional in the sense that we hear this from workers all over. One worker in Bedford, Indiana, writes to us, "You handed out newsletters at the powertrain plant recently, and I just wanted to inform you that you really opened a lot of people's eyes. Everyone I've spoken to about it says the same thing and agrees with a lot of what you guys are saying." Another worker from Kentucky says, "I think you guys are doing a great job informing us of all the things automotive and related to the union. We need to keep our eyes open." And another worker in Michigan says, "If it wasn't for the World Socialist Web Site Autoworker Newsletter, a lot of people wouldn't have rejected the deal. The newsletter was instrumental and vocal in supporting us and giving us the knowledge we needed. We didn't have that information, and the newsletter told the truth." And that is an important point because the newsletter not only reflects the growth and support for the newsletter and the over 1,000 workers who have signed up for its updates over the last weeks, isn't just a product of opposition, but it also seeks to develop and deepen the opposition so that a real fight can be waged against the companies.
Did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think the points Eric are correct. The Autoworker Newsletter has provided a voice, first of all, under conditions in which the monopoly over information by the UAW, and I mean literally, workers have been kept entirely in the dark. Were given no information as the deadline approached. They would get one-sentence statements on the Facebook page of the UAW. So the website provided, and the Autoworker Newsletter provided, a means in which workers could communicate with each other, to exchange information. They would send us vote totals from their locals. And throughout this whole experience, the UAW was denouncing social media. They were livid that workers found a means to express themselves. Then they began denouncing outside agitators. The president of the UAW, Dennis Williams, denounced outside agitators. We were then red-baited by the Metro Detroit AFL-CIO's general counsel, who wrote a letter denouncing us, the World Socialist Web Site, as vultures in red garb. And well, to tell you the truth, I mean, this is coming from a union who claimed there was no money, that they couldn't get a penny more. Now, we never got any phone calls from Dennis Williams thanking us for insisting that, in fact, this was a sellout and that workers should fight for much more. No such calls came to us, of course. But the UAW then turned around, and it's claiming that it's won the richest contract in history. And they've hired this PR firm, which I think they haven't made a very good use of their $115,000 in paying these people, because they produced a video. I mean, it's like one of the poor advertisements you might get during the halftime at the Super Bowl game, But they brought together a bunch of local union officials saying that the no vote was the greatest thing ever because it meant that the union was united and strengthened and was really sending a message to Sergio. But these are the same people that were doing everything they could to lie to workers, to push this rotten contract through. And the one thing I think is very important, the workers are looking for a means to communicate, to link up their struggles. We brought the Autoworkers Newsletter. If we might show some of the slides of the Autoworker Newsletter being distributed to workers in Canada, being distributed there. That's in Canada, Brampton, Ontario. Workers in Germany at the General Motors Opel factory in Rüsselsheim. Also workers outside of Paris. Also workers in Australia, where the auto companies are threatening to eliminate the entire auto industry. And everywhere, workers in other countries hailed the stand taken by Fiat Chrysler workers, welcomed it, said we face the same problems with contracting out, low-paid wages to contractors. And we face the same problem that we have trade unions that are thoroughly in bed with the corporations and the governments and are attacking us. So it's through the Autoworkers Newsletter that we have physically connected the struggle of workers in the United States with workers around the world, auto workers with other sections of workers like steel workers and Verizon workers, John Deere workers who are facing the same struggles.
So, Jerry, I just wanted to turn now to some of the programmatic questions raised by the WSWS's intervention in the auto workers struggle. A lot of workers we speak to wanted clarification on this question of a rank-and-file committee that we're calling for. And they're asking, is this simply another union? What is a rank-and-file committee?
Well, from the very beginning, we have said that the independent interests of workers and their fight, even to win the most basic questions, decent wages, secure jobs, an end to the two-tier system, meant a direct collision between workers, all of the auto companies, the auto bosses, against the Wall Street banks that are behind them, behind the Obama administration, which has imposed these conditions. That it was impossible for this opposition of workers to be expressed through a trade union organization, which is a union in name only. I mean, when workers think of unions, they think of the struggles of the 1930s, struggles, in fact, led by socialists, the sit-down strikes, that workers collectively came together, fought for improvements in their living standards, resisted the attacks of the employers. But that in no sense describes the UAW, the Teamsters, any other trade union in the United States, or in fact, unions around the world. The trade unions, which, as I said, were built in the mass struggles of the 1930s, from the very beginning, the leaders of these unions, including Walter Reuther, tied these unions to the Democratic Party, prevented a direct challenge to the capitalist system, accepted the framework of the system. And while that political betrayal was concealed for a time in the post-war period when American capitalism still remained the dominant force and could afford to throw certain concessions to workers, its consequences became very clear with the decline of American capitalism in the late 1970s and the emergence of globalization. Under conditions where companies can move from one country to the other, the trade unions, based on nationalism and a defense of the capitalist system, had no progressive answer. So instead, they adopted corporatism, labor management partnership. The UAW based itself, in fact, on the labor business syndicates promoted by Mussolini and in Nazi Germany, which claimed that there was no independent interest of workers, that workers had to subordinate all their interests to the profits and competitiveness of the corporations and their national struggle. So throughout this period, especially in the 1980s, the unions and the union apparatus, having betrayed workers and allowed hundreds of thousands of jobs to disappear, they found new sources of income, labor management committees, VEBA funds, sitting on boards of directors. So their interest was completely separated from that of workers themselves. In fact, they had a financial interest in cutting the wages of workers, in cutting health care benefits. So immediately, and it became so clear in the run-up to this contract struggle, the union was on the other side. So for workers to express their interest, new organizations had to be built. That is, rank-and-file factory committees elected from among workers themselves, the most courageous, class-conscious workers in the factories, to link up and communicate with other sections of workers, to link up with workers internationally. But these are not just other trade unions, because workers don't confront trade union challenges, they confront political challenges. The fight, as I said before, to defend the most elemental social rights of the working class is a conflict against the entire capitalist system. All over the world, austerity is the code word, the slashing of wages, the pitting of one worker in one country against the other, the attack on democratic rights, the threat of war. To defend the most elemental rights of workers, workers have to begin to organize ourselves as an independent political force. So factory committees, first of all, would not accept the framework of the capitalist system. They would be bound to the defense of the social rights of the working class.
I mean, I agree with those points. In addition, I would say the workers today have seen the product of decades and decades of betrayals and concessions, the efforts by the leadership of the UAW to tie the workers to the Democratic Party in particular, under the lie that if workers accepted the Democratic Party as the more popular, as they say, the more popular party, that as a result, the workers would have a voice in Washington. They would have a voice in politics. This was bandied about over the decades and continues to be the slogan of AFL-CIO leaders like Richard Trumka and Dennis Williams. But workers can look at what representation does the working class have in Washington? Absolutely none. And after the decades in which there have been basically zero strikes, I think last year, for example, if you look, there were 11 strikes of more than 1,000 workers. This is down from a period in the 1930s and even during the Second World War and after, where on any given day, there were hundreds of thousands of workers out on strike. And all of this has been undertaken under the leadership of the UAW and its program of preventing the workers from developing an independent political movement of its own.
I just wanted to read a quote from the transitional program authored by Trotsky on the question of factory committees, and perhaps you could speak on it. He wrote, "The prime significance of the committee lies in the fact that it becomes the militant staff for such working class layers as the trade union is usually incapable in moving to actions. Factory committees open the door, if not to a direct revolutionary, then to a pre-revolutionary period between the bourgeois and the proletarian regimes. That is, they open the doors for the struggle by the working class against the capitalist system." Could you maybe speak about that? And what are the broader political questions that have to be bound up with the creation of rank-and-file committees?
Well, workers need collective organizations. There's no way to confront vast transnational corporations and governments outside of the fight for the maximum unity of the working class, the enormous strength of the working class, the working class that creates the wealth of society. Its collective labor creates the wealth all over the world. But a trade union accepts implicitly the capitalist system. It accepts the system in which a small minority of the population, the owners of the banks, the owners of the corporations, extract profits from the labor of the working class and appropriate those profits privately. The working class has absolutely no say-so over the distribution of the vast sums of wealth that we create. And the issue of building up new popular democratic forms of organization of the working class to assert our interests, that doesn't begin, as the unions do, with what's competitive for the corporations or what is profitable from the corporations, but begins from what are the social rights of the working class? What are the basic elemental needs of workers for secure and good-paying jobs, for health care, for pensions, for a future for the youth free from war and poverty? That requires and is, in fact, a political struggle. And when I use the phrase political struggle, I don't mean within the realm of the two big business parties and their lies and their the fact that whether it's a Democrat or Republican, ultimately they answer to the Wall Street banks. What I mean by a political struggle is the organization of the overwhelming majority of the population, the working class, to fight for political power so that the decision-making is in the hands of the millions of workers who produce society's wealth. No one came to the working population and asked us whether we supported the bailout of the banks in 2008. No one came to the population and asked whether we support these wars and the squandering of trillions of dollars. But it's through the two-party system, through the government, the courts, the laws that protect the wealthy elite and the financial aristocracy, no matter what crimes they carry out, whether it's the use of defective ignition switches by General Motors executives or VW executives, nothing happens to them, or Wall Street bankers, they get away scot-free. But the working class is made to pay for this crisis because we are completely disenfranchised. So the building of factory committees in the neighborhoods, uniting the working class, first of all, in the factories, it creates the conditions really of dual power. That is a real organization that speaks for the workers, not a UAW or other union, which is a company union, which imposes the dictates of the corporations. And it's through the building of the much more popular, democratic, or self-organization of the working class that we unite every section of workers against unemployment, against the cutting off of utilities, against the danger of war, against police killings, against the efforts to pit American workers against our brothers in other parts of the world, and unify in a political struggle. That is to fight to assert workers' control over society, workers' control of why should vast industrial concerns like Fiat Chrysler or General Motors be the playthings of wealthy Wall Street investors? The whole organization of the production of automobiles, which involves the labor of millions of workers around the world, which involves the skill of technicians, of skilled engineers. The development of the fantastic technology in auto production constantly comes into conflict with the self-interest of the Wall Street investors and CEOs who can't think beyond tomorrow to see how much they could boost their bonuses and shareholders. And the UAW, in fact, is part of that process. It is one of the largest shareholders of General Motors. It sits on corporate boards, and it defends the capitalist system. So workers need new organizations, both for industrial struggle, but above all for the political struggle of the working class over determining who rules society.
You're listening to The Way Forward for Auto Workers, an online interview with Jerry White and Eric London. We're about halfway through our program. At this point, I would like to encourage our readers to send questions that you would like Jerry and Eric to answer. Also, I would encourage our readers to donate as generously as possible today. All of the work that Jerry and Eric have been speaking about is made possible by the donations of our readers and supporters. I would also encourage our listeners to go to Mehring.com, take a look at some of the links on the streaming page for some books that we are discussing here, including Marxism and the Trade Unions by Leon Trotsky and the Program of the Socialist Equality Party. Both are available on the links on the page and also at Mehring.com. That's MEHRING.com. So now I'd like to turn to a question from a listener. This is coming from India. The reader asks, how do we take the U.S. auto workers' struggle to workers here in Maruti Suzuki, India, and how do we help them form their own independent organizations? We have mentioned auto worker struggles at a crossroad. Is this specific to the U.S. only?
Well, as I said, from the interviews that we've gotten from workers in France, in Germany, Australia, as well as the struggle, as the reader indicates, the Maruti Suzuki workers rebelled and sought to build a new organization against the company union. And everywhere, as I've indicated, workers explain they have the same problem. There's a determination to fight, but they have trade union organizations, nationalist trade union organizations that subordinate the interests of workers to the competitive and profit drive of individual corporations. Now, the Maruti Suzuki workers rebelled, and they came into a conflict with the Stalinist-controlled unions, with the Indian National Congress government, whose official policy is to make the Indian workers make India the sweatshop of the world, to compete with China over who will be the cheapest source of labor. So the strivings of Maruti Suzuki workers who were framed up for the murder of a supervisor, many of them thrown in prison, the leaders of this new organization of workers jailed, tortured. The lessons of the struggles of the American workers, the fight for the building of rank-and-file factory committees, the fight to unify the broadest sections of workers, the need for an international struggle. It has everything to do with Indian workers or Chinese workers or Mexican workers, workers in Canada and within the United States. It's one of the issues, Andre, that has come up with our discussion with auto workers is that can the UAW be reformed? There is enormous hatred. Workers will say that they're selling them out. We had many experiences in which the UAW actually took temporary workers several years ago who actually had worked up to a $28 an hour job, and the UAW told these workers, if you want to get a full-time job and keep your job, you have to come in at an entry wage of $16 an hour. The UAW blackmailed workers to take a $12 an hour wage cut. There's enormous hostility to the lies, the keeping the conspiracy of silence. But many workers think that, and perhaps it's quite natural, that if they exert enough pressure on the UAW, if they reject contracts, and of course these contracts deserve to be rejected, but that somehow if there's enough pressure from below, the UAW will change its stripes. It will then once again represent workers. Other workers have said if we carry out lawsuits because our rights have been trampled, and once again workers are very well motivated to carry out lawsuits. But can you change the courts? Would the government come in on the side of workers to change the UAW and turn it into something that it has not been? And such conceptions are very deliberately promoted by such organizations as the Auto Worker Caravan, publications like Labor Notes or the International Socialist Organization, and a lower level of union officials inside of the UAW. And they don't want workers to break from the authority of the UAW. They don't want workers to develop a political alternative to the UAW and its support to the Democratic Party. And our analysis of the unions, it doesn't flow from saying the degeneration of the unions is simply the product of corrupt and cowardice leaders like Dennis Williams and Cindy Estrada. As corrupt and cowardly as they are, that's not the fundamental reason for the degeneration of the unions. They are the product of the degeneration of the unions. They are the product of the establishment of labor management collaboration and partnership, corporatism that was produced, that was initiated in the 1980s. The unions cannot be reformed because they're tied to the capitalist system, to the nation-state system. They have developed business interests, which are completely hostile to that of workers. So we urge workers, and this has come up, workers want to fight, but the question is not placing their confidence in the false hope in transforming the unions, but in the necessity to break fundamentally from these organizations and build rank-and-file factory committees, which are bound up with the development, the political mobilization of the working class.
Now, the UAW has denounced the so-called hidden agenda of the WSWS Autoworker Newsletter, but anyone who reads the WSWS knows that there is nothing hidden about its agenda. So I just wanted to ask you, Eric, what's the relationship of socialism to the struggle facing autoworkers?
Well, first of all, I would say you want to talk about a hidden agenda. I'd say the UAW working with the company behind the backs of the workers in a conspiracy to ram through a sellout. I'd say that's a pretty clear hidden agenda. But of course, we expect the UAW to attack us because we're telling the truth. And workers who have spoken to us and workers who have received our newsletter, they know what we're about. We're socialists. You know, that's on the front of our website. It's on the cover of every newsletter we hand out at the factory gates. And it's a part of the conversation that we have with workers all over the country when we speak to them. And it's important, I think, that socialism is becoming a part of the conversation amongst auto workers. Because, yes, we were attacked by the general counsel of the AFL-CIO, who wrote a letter that was published by the UAW in which he denounces the Autoworker Newsletter as red vultures in left garb. Well, first of all, that was the same tactic that was used by Ford and his thugs in the 1930s when workers, under the leadership of socialists, were developing and were marching there were marches of the unemployed. There were the strikes, the Briggs strike of the early 1930s. The Flint sit-down strike, in fact, was led by two Trotskyists, Kermit Johnson and Janora Johnson at Flint number 4. But I think so they say we have a hidden agenda. Yes, we think that there is something fundamentally wrong with the capitalist order in which a man like Sergio Marchionne can make $72 million a year while the vast majority of auto workers struggle to make their mortgage and car payments, to put food on the table for their children. And when vast swaths of what used to be the world's center of industrial production have been transformed into centers of poverty and inequality. You look at cities like Detroit, Toledo, Central Indiana, Louisville, Kentucky. You know, these St. Louis, where auto plants have been shut down at Hazelwood, for example, in the recent past. And we're for putting the control of production in the hands of the class that makes the wealth for the corporations. We support the working class taking production into its own hands and running it democratically to meet the human needs of the vast majority of the population, not for the private profit of a select few. Now, this attorney with the AFL-CIO, he attacks socialism. He also attacks us for holding a meeting on the assassination of Leon Trotsky, who was one of the leaders of the Russian Revolution of 1917. And if there wasn't a Russian Revolution, well, there wouldn't have been a strike movement to the United States in the 1930s, which was inspired in large part by the sympathy amongst American workers for what the working class had done in Russia. Overthrew the Tsar, ended the First World War, confiscated the land of the rich landowners, took control of the bank accounts of the rich, emptied their vaults, and reorganized society to meet the needs of the population. And we're proud to be socialists. We're open about it, and anybody who says we have a hidden agenda should do a little bit more research.
And of course, the socialists played a major leading role in the construction of the industrial unions in the United States, right?
Well, clearly, as Eric indicated, the Russian Revolution had a worldwide impact in inspiring the working class and encouraging it over its own revolutionary capacities. The history of the American working class up into the 1930s was one of ruthless, bloody suppression of any expression of opposition. The Haymarket Martyrs, the Homestead Strike, the shooting down of strikers, the frame up of workers, the murder of socialist leaders. And it was the success of the Russian Revolution that inspired the breakthrough within the United States. As Eric indicated, the leaders of the Flint sit-down strike were Trotskyists. The leaders of the Toledo auto light strike were Trotskyists. And Roosevelt, who was no fool, I mean, he's a ruling class leader, he understood that if there weren't concessions made to the American working class in the New Deal in the 1930s, he might have an October Revolution on his own hands. So the decision was made to allow the legalization of mass trade unions. And ultimately, right at the very beginning, there were two roads. There was the roads fought for by the socialists, by the Trotskyists, who said the working class doesn't only need industrial organization, it needs a political party of its own. The working class has to oppose the dictatorship of the banks, of the 60 rich families that controlled everything. It had to fight to put the industries under the democratic control of the working class. It had to oppose war. The other side was that route taken by Reuther, who himself had been a right-wing social democrat. He could never have been elected to become the president of the UAW if he wasn't known as a socialist because of the impact of the Russian Revolution. But by the late 1940s, Reuther carried out a vicious anti-communist purge. Among his opponents were those who said it should never have been called McCarthyism, it should have been called Reutherism. He drove out the socialist pioneers. He tied the unions directly to the Democratic Party, which precluded any radical reorganization of society, any attack on the entrenched wealth and the private control of industry. But he bet that American capitalism would be the dominant force for all eternity. He claimed, well, if there was a 6% increase in productivity every year, new technology, the companies would get the benefit of half of that, the workers would get the benefit of the other half. He blocked the development of a labor party. He infamously said in 1950, workers in America don't need a labor party because there are no sharp social divisions between classes in America, not like in Europe. Well, of course, after 35 years of deindustrialization, the suppression of strikes, and the explosive growth of inequality, the class divisions are very apparent. And I think it's very important. They see that the point is everything was done to try to convince workers that they had the same interests as the capitalists. And I came across recently a quote I thought was interesting from Lee Iacocca, the CEO of Chrysler. And of course, he was the one that imposed massive cuts with the help of the UAW. But he said, and I thought he said this in 1984, as long as a guy is making enough money to meet his mortgage payments, eat fairly well, drive a car, send his kid to college, and go out with his wife once a week for dinner and a show, he's satisfied. And if the middle class is content, we'll never have a civil war or a revolution. Well, when he's talking of the middle class, he's talking about the working class. And the fact of the matter is that the working class isn't content. The working class is being deprived of every essential necessity of life. So the issue of revolution, the issue of the class division of society is becoming apparent to millions.
What are some of the political questions and issues that come up in your discussions with auto workers? I'm sure the question of Sanders must be coming up a lot.
Eric referred to socialism being in the air. Well, the Democratic Party itself, which is very frightened of a movement from the left, of workers breaking with this capitalist party, they've put on their own self-fashioned socialist, a man by the name of Bernie Sanders. You know, first of all, Sanders, who talks about the billionaire class and its control of the political system, has no problem being part of the Democratic Party, which is controlled by the billionaire class. And he's openly said he wants to use the enthusiasm his campaign has generated, especially among young people, to channel it back behind the Democratic Party. But his foreign policy, his support for war, his support for what Obama is doing in Afghanistan and Syria, his promotion of economic nationalism to tie workers to the interests of American big business, that reveals most clearly that Sanders is not a socialist. He's a defender of the present order, and he's being used to try to trap the opposition that's growing among workers and youth and contain it within the two-party capitalist political system.
Well, just getting to the question of the way forward, we're coming close to the conclusion of our program, and I wanted to steer the discussion towards this topic. We have a question from a worker in Washington who asked, "My question is, to what extent must rank-and-file committees work within the legal structure of the UAW, if at all, to secure the assets of the union, that is, the strike fund, retirement healthcare fund, etc., for the workers? Will auto workers have any way to recover the money stolen by the UAW?"
Workers have got to organize a rebellion, and they have to, in fact, fight to seize control of the assets. The strike fund, there's a chart up that shows the strike fund that was valued at around $1 billion at the beginning of the last decade is now around $600 million because the UAW has diverted money which was accumulated from workers' union dues, including the 25% increase in union dues imposed last year. They've diverted this money to meet the bloated salaries of the more than 1,000 union functionaries that are on the international staff. So those assets are absolutely belong to workers. And the courts, while workers have every legitimate right to utilize the courts to fight for their rights, the fact is that the government is well aware that the union is a dictatorship over workers. The National Labor Relations Board is well aware. It's their dictatorship. It's the dictatorship of the government and of the corporations over the working class. That is the job of the UAW and the AFL-CIO. And they are paid handsomely for it, to impose the will of the corporations and the banks and the government. So the question of taking control of the resources that workers deserve is bound up with the relationship of class forces, the development of a powerful rebellion of workers against the UAW. I think if we're heading towards the conclusion, workers face very complex political challenges. To discuss the way forward is always bound up. When you want to discuss what strategy, what way forward for workers, it's always bound up with an understanding, an objective understanding of the forces that are arrayed against workers and drawing the experiences from the class struggle, the experiences of history, reviving the very powerful traditions among auto workers of socialism, of a political struggle of the working class, of internationalism. The rejection, the first no vote, is an indication of the enormous social anger that has been pent up in the United States, suppressed by the trade unions for decades, and it's a sign of the reemergence of the American working class alongside of its brothers and sisters in open class conflict. And that poses to the American ruling class, which has literally been able to get away with murder, waging criminal wars, attacking the living standards of workers around the world. Now, all of a sudden, the prospect is that it won't be the master of its own house, that within the United States, there is a powerful social force, the working class, which has been, if you were to listen to the musings of the pseudo-left or the so-called left academics, they've written off the working class. They say the working class is part of the system. Well, it's not part of the system. Its very existence is an antipode to the capitalist system. The question that auto workers in every section of the working class confront is reestablishing its connection to history, to understand the great political questions, the need for internationalism, the need for its own political independence, and the need for socialism. And I think that we are seeing that this is just once again, the very beginning of an immense reemergence of the class struggle in America as part of the class struggle around the world.
Well, I'd like to thank Jerry White and Eric London for taking the time to speak with us today. Just as an indicator of the significance of their work and the work of the WSWS, I'd like to read a comment that we just received from Turkey, which shows the way in which the struggle of the U.S. auto workers is being followed internationally. The reader writes, "Greetings, U.S. auto workers from Turkey. In May, about 20,000 auto and metal workers in Turkey revolted against the auto and metal companies Renault, Fiat, and Ford, and the trade union Turkmental. In Turkey, workers and youth who are interested in the U.S. auto worker struggle are following the WSWS and Autoworker Newsletter. We closely follow our class brothers and sisters' struggle in the United States. So I think that points to some of the international scope and significance of the issues that were raised today. I would like to thank all of our listeners for participating and conclude by urging all of you to donate to the WSWS Autoworker Newsletter and WSWS. In addition to our daily coverage on the WSWS, we publish a daily email newsletter, which I would encourage everyone to sign up for, and a weekly print newsletter, which we distribute to factories all over the country. All of this takes resources. Jerry and Eric work very hard, but we need the support of our readers and our supporters to continue and expand our work. So I'd like to urge everyone participating to make a sacrifice and donate today. Finally, I'd like to encourage our listeners to visit Mehring Books at mehring.com. That's mehring.com. In particular, I'd encourage you to purchase and read two books, The Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century by David North, and The Program of the Socialist Equality Party, both of which deal with many of the same issues that Jerry and Eric had discussed today. Finally, to sign up for the Autoworkers newsletter, you can visit wsws.org/autoworkers. So Jerry and Eric, thank you very much for your time today, and I thought it was, for all involved, a very interesting and edifying discussion.
Thank you, Andre.